What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the JT Sports Podcast. I'm your host, JT. College football is in some unforeseen times right now. When you watch this sport on Saturdays, it feels like nothing has changed. The game is still played the same way, but beneath the surface, college football is no longer the sport that a lot of us grew up watching. It's not about regionality anymore. Recruiting battles are no longer about programs trying to pitch to recruits that they're the best program to spend their next 3-4 years with because they give them the best shot of not only getting developed, but also having a chance to compete for a national championship. Now recruiting wars feel more like Madden Ultimate Team. Everybody's in a bidding war to try to get all of the best players, trying to give them the biggest bag, and it's all about trying to piece together the most expensive team that money can buy. And the more expensive the team is, the better your chances are at competing at the highest level. And no program perfectly encapsulates what college football has become better than Texas Tech, because Texas Tech, they're putting that oil money to good use, and they are using it to disturb the power balance of college football. For a long time, it's been thought that the SEC and the Big Ten run this sport, and everybody else is beneath them. But Texas Tech, what they've done with their oil money is that they've used it to essentially buy a SEC level roster. They got the second best portal class from this past cycle. Only LSU is above them. And they got a lot of good players on this team now. And not only are they buying up some of the best players out of the transfer portal, but they also are outbidding teams for blue chip recruits, offering them times 3 more money than what anybody else is offering them. And essentially, Texas Tech is taking advantage of what college football is right now, which is pay to win, which is why you heard Deion Sanders at Big 12 Media Days bring up the idea of implementing a salary cap similar to what the NFL is. Because we thought when the playoffs expanded to 12 teams, that would have been the secret to bringing about parity in college football, when all is done is further increase the gap between the elite programs in this sport and the non-elites. But what I feel is starting to close the gap in college football is name, image, and likeness. If you have a team that isn't a blue blood but has access to a lot of NIL money, that can be what brings about a lot more parity in this sport. And Texas Tech is one of those teams that has the ability to do that. They have a huge donor who is a billionaire, and he's donated a lot to Texas Tech this season in terms of the overall construction of the roster. And not just does Texas Tech football have a lot of money into this program, but Texas Tech across all sports is spending $55 million total, with the school participating in $20.5 million of that to what their sports programs are right now. And if Texas Tech wins a playoff game this year, let's say they win the Big 12, they make it to the playoffs, and they pull off an upset against a team like Alabama, it will further show what college football has become, what we all fear, because it no longer is about heart, it's no longer about passion, it's all about paying to get the best team that money can buy. And essentially, that's what Joey McGuire has done, entering another season as Texas Tech's head coach. And he's done a really good job with this program. They won 8 games last season, which is a good year for Texas Tech standards, but now they're upping the ante. And with them having so much money to spend, you can no longer view Texas Tech as your average run-of-the-mill Big 12 school, because with the roster that Texas Tech has right now entering this season, they will be the equal to a top 7 or better team in the SEC with how good they are on the offensive line, the defensive line. This is a SEC team playing in the Big 12, which is what makes this team so fascinating to watch, Because what happens when you do assemble the best team that money can buy in the conference where there's a huge discrepancy between what you can spend in NIL and what everybody else can spend? Colorado might only be able to spend $10 million on this year's team. So when they're going up against Texas Tech, who, let's say, maybe their team is worth $30 million, how is that going to look? What if Texas Tech just completely obliterates everybody that they play in the Big 12 this year, and they're blowing people out by 2 or more touchdowns in every single game? They win this conference championship. They go to the playoffs. They pull off an upset, and maybe they make somewhat of a Cinderella run. Can you imagine how different we will view this sport now? Because now, with the Big Ten and the SEC seeking AQs because it's perceived that their conference are far more superior than everybody else, if Texas Tech is able to play up to how they should with how much they've invested into this year's team, then you have to throw all of that out of the window, because now it's not about who has the most talent. It's about who is able to spend the most money to assemble the most talented team possible. Therefore, making the comparison between which conference has the better quality of depth in terms of elite teams, it doesn't really matter anymore. Because if Texas Tech is spending this amount of money and they're having success, then that's a clear indicator to everybody else. It's not about the conference that you play in. It's about how much money does every team in each conference have to spend in order to assemble a championship caliber football team. The difference between the Big Ten, the SEC, compared to everybody else in college football is that a lot of teams in the Power 2 have access to a lot of resources and a lot of money, mainly the blue bloods like Ohio State, Georgia, Texas. But what happens when you have a non-blue blood like Texas Tech right now that essentially has similar resources to what those top programs have? Then essentially you just can assume that the Big 12 will automatically lose to a SEC opponent if they were matched up against one, if you have a roster that looks like what Texas Tech has. When you see Texas Tech on the field this year, you're obviously going to tell the difference between them and everybody else in this conference with the size and athleticism that they're going to have on their front seven, on defense, and on the offensive line. There's going to be a huge gap between them and everybody else. The only thing that's holding Texas Tech back maybe is the high expectations. They say it's not always about the X's and O's. It's about the Jimmies and Joes. Well, Texas Tech has a bunch of Jimmies and Joes this year. The question is the coaching going to be able to bring this team together, or are we going to see a similar situation that we saw play out in College Station a few years ago that ultimately got Jimbo Fisher fired when he bought the best recruiting class that money can buy, and it all fell apart because he was unable to get those guys to come together as a team and win. But college football no longer is about conferences necessarily. It's all about, do you have conferences that have teams that have enough money to buy a roster that's good enough to compete with anybody? And if Texas Tech is really good this year and they win the playoffs, or they win a playoff game along with this conference, now it's going to be an arms race to see who can get the most boosters and donors together to get the most influx of cash possible to pour into their football programs. This is how college football is going to end up having more parity. It's not going to be by allocating more playoff spots. It's not going to be about, making the schedules more favorable for teams that are outside of the SEC and the Big 12. It's all about, can these non-Big Ten and SEC teams get enough money to assemble a roster on par with what you see from the best teams in the SEC and the Big Ten? And Texas Tech is going to be a fascinating case study to watch this season. If they end up being as good as what this roster looks like on paper that they paid for, it's going to completely change the rest of this sport. Oklahoma, without a doubt, is easily the most hated program in college football, because no matter what this team does to try to be able to assemble the best team possible, all you hear is why this season is going to be another disappointment. No matter if Brent Venables went out there and fixed the two biggest issues that was responsible for one of the worst seasons that the Sooners have had in 26 years, it still isn't good enough in the eyes of non-Oklahoma fans. Brent Venables goes out and he hires Ben Arbuckle to be his new offensive coordinator, and he's able to get Ben Arbuckle's quarterback and John Mateer to follow him down to Norman, which John Mateer by himself accounted for more touchdowns and more yardage than what Oklahoma had as a team last year. But yet, John Mateer is being doubted and disrespected all because he comes from an inferior conference and didn't really look that good against good competition, even though he was playing on Washington State, a program that only produced one NFL draft pick on offense from last season. But you see, context always never is brought up when it comes to Oklahoma, because all folks who talk about Oklahoma want to do is just find ways to pick holes and find a way to tear down this program instead of trying to find ways to analyze this team from a fair standpoint. John Mateer was the number one rated quarterback in the transfer portal. The last couple of quarterbacks that have been rated number one in the transfer portal have all turned out to have really good stints with their new programs. Cam Ward, for example, was the number one rated quarterback in last year's transfer portal cycle, and he was a Heisman finalist. But since John Mateer plays for Oklahoma, it's all he's going to get exposed playing against better competition. You know, it's funny to me how John Mateer is getting knocked for the level of competition that he went up against, right? But nobody's betting an eye about Joey Aguilar at Tennessee. Everybody thinks that Joey Aguilar could be just as good, if not better, than what Nico Imaviava was, even though Tennessee is what most of us would call to be a rebuilding year with everything that they have to replace from last season. But nobody's trashing Joey Aguilar. But since John Mateer decided that he wanted to play for Oklahoma, he's overrated. He's not going to look good against SEC competition. If you take a quarterback that scored 44 touchdowns, the most in college football last year, he was the only quarterback in the nation with 20 passing touchdowns and 10 rushing touchdowns on a squad that lacked a lot of talent, and you put him on an Oklahoma team that has a bunch of blue chip receivers, guys that they either acquired in the transfer portal that were held in high regard or were 4 stars or better coming out of high school. I don't think that is stupid to think that John Mateer's production is going to do nothing but increase with him having better talent to throw to, especially with him following his offensive coordinator to the same spot that he's in right now. It would be another thing if John Mateer was coming to Oklahoma having to learn an entirely new system, but that's not the case. If anything, John Mateer should be in the perfect situation to not just build off what he did at Washington State, but to also be able to have the similar impact for Oklahoma that we saw Cam Ward have on Miami last year. Miami had a lot of issues last season, and Cam Ward was able to mask them with how good he was able to play. We can see John Mateer do the same thing with the wide receivers that he's throwing to, receiving better coaching than what he got at Washington State. You see, there's really weird arguments against why John Mateer is not going to succeed at Oklahoma that it just sounds like goalpost moving to me. It just seems like people hate to hear the idea of Oklahoma having a really good season, so they want to play these stupid, dumbass mental gymnastics to try to find any way to convince themselves that Oklahoma is going to be relevant in the SEC when this program is never going to be irrelevant. They have too much money and too much resources for that to happen. People are just finding any way possible to prey on the downfall of the Oklahoma Sooners, and they want to do it in the most dumbest way possible, trying to find a way to call a quarterback who is the number one rated QB out of this past portal cycle overrated. It makes no sense to me. I don't know if it's Texas fans. I don't know if it's just jealous SEC fans because they wanted John Mateer and they were unable to get him. But Miami offered more money for John Mateer to come to South Florida than what Oklahoma did. If he would have went to Miami, nobody would have been saying these things about him not going up against great competition, perceiving him to be overrated. But because he chose to play for Oklahoma, though, he is the one who gets all of this flack. I don't even think that Carson Beck is getting talked down upon as much as what John Mateer was. And if I had to choose between John Mateer and Carson Beck, I'm picking John Mateer. John Mateer has a lot of similarities in his playing style to what Bo Nix does. He's an efficient passer, and he's incredibly athletic. And even if John Mateer isn't as good with Oklahoma as what we saw him with Washington State last year, I promise you, it can't get no worse than what Oklahoma had at quarterback. When Oklahoma played Tennessee last season, I literally thought that Jackson Arnold was colluding with Vegas to lose that game for Oklahoma. With the amount of turnovers that he had, you would have thought that he was Santa's secret helper and he just wanted Tennessee to win that game. He felt bad for Josh Heupel and he wanted Josh Heupel to get his revenge on Oklahoma, and you can't convince me otherwise because the way he was turning that football over like it was Christmas in September, we all probably would have thought the same thing if we didn't know no better. You can't get no worse than what Oklahoma was at quarterback last year. So even if John Mateer isn't that good, he won't be the worst quarterback in the SEC this year. And we can put money on that. You can't get no worse than Jackson Arnold and Michael Hawkins. No offense to those brothers, but they were not good. Literally, the only way Oklahoma was able to win games was acting like they were Iowa. And you can't win games in the SEC playing like you're Iowa. They're the only program that I can think of that's been able to win despite not having good quarterback play. You're going to get way better quarterback play from John Mateer than what you got out of your two starters at this position last year, which is why I don't understand the amount of jealousy and hate that non-Sooner fans have towards John Mateer. Now, the media is really high on John Mateer, but the non-media guys seem to be the only ones that think that this kid is overrated, he's not going to pan out, and it's only because he plays for Oklahoma. If he would have went to any other program, if he would have went to Ohio State, Alabama, everybody and their grandma would have been hyping this dude up. But since he plays for the most hated program in college football, he's the one that's getting all of this doubt because of where he played. Do you not know how many great quarterbacks came from lower level schools? I mean, like, where you come from has little to do with how good you're going to be. What matters is that you have the skill set, you have the intangibles to take advantage of having a better situation to thrive in than what you did at your previous stop. In Washington State, over the last couple of years, has been a gold mine for quarterbacks. Cam Ward balled out of Miami. They had another quarterback behind Cam Ward that was balling out at San Jose State, and then they got John Mateer. So if you get a quarterback from Washington State, you're in pretty good shape. They normally produce some really prolific quarterbacks. I just can't fathom John Mateer completely fizzling out and being worse than what Jackson Arnold and Michael Hawkins were in 2024. The mental gymnastics has to stop. The SEC is just jealous of what John Mateer is about to do at Oklahoma this year. I expect this guy to put up Heisman numbers, to be at least a top 3 quarterback in this conference, and to have Oklahoma winning 9 games this year. It's not unrealistic to think that. And all of the numbers support this argument that John Mateer is going to be way better. He's going to provide a bigger spark to this offense with what he's able to do, not just throwing the ball, but on the ground as well. Georgia won the SEC last year despite having a down season. Their offense wasn't as good as what it has been in years past. The wide receivers were a main reason for that. They essentially had bricks for hands. Anytime they were wide open, it seemed like they didn't want to make plays and they didn't want to catch the football. And then their offensive production went down as well because Georgia, prior to 2024, for the last 3 seasons before that, they were top 10 in college football in explosive plays that went for 10 yards or more. In 2024, they fell to 22nd in the country in that department. And the main reason for why Georgia's explosive play production fell down was because the receivers weren't dynamic. How did they fix that problem? They got Zachariah Branch out of the transfer portal, and this was the last thing that Georgia needed if you're somebody that's rooting for the downfall of the Kirby Smart Georgia Empire, because Zachariah Branch is going to fix the biggest flaw that this team had last year, because what he specializes in is being instant offense. That's what he's going to be for the Dogs this year. This is somebody that you don't overthink it. All you do is just put the ball in his hands, and he's a threat to take it to the house for 6 every time the ball is in his possession, because he is the fastest player in college football. And what he does in the open field with the variety of different moves that he can put on guys, he's going to be a nightmare for opposing defenses to slow down when they played Georgia this year. You see, last year, Georgia's offense was predictable because with them no longer having Brock Bowers, you didn't really have anybody that was that dynamic. You didn't even have a Lot McConkey level threat, a guy that could be an elite route runner and be able to create a lot of separation. So that hindered a lot of what made Georgia's offense explosive in years past. With Zachariah Branch, you can get him involved with bubble screens, reverses, jet sweeps. You can throw a bomb downfield 50 yards and he can come down with it due to how fast he is, because this isn't a guy that you want to line up one-on-one with a cornerback and no safety help over the top, because he's just too potent at receiver for you to even want to take that risk. When you have somebody that has this kind of game-changing speed, Olympic-like speed, it completely changes how defenses have to defend your offense. And Zachariah Branch puts so much stress on opposing defenses that it's going to open things up for the rest of these Georgia wide receivers. And when Zachariah Branch was at USC, I know that he didn't have the type of production that you expect from somebody who is a 5-star recruit, but I blame his lack of production on Lincoln Riley not really finding innovative ways to get him the football. Georgia has been well known for producing elite speedsters, such as when they had Miko Hartman years ago. Arian Smith came up with some big plays during his course of his Georgia careers. Georgia's used to knowing how to get the best out of guys that have this kind of skill set. But Zachariah Branch, there still is a lot of untapped potential that hasn't really been reached with him because there hasn't been a coaching staff that's been able to get the most out of this guy. Look, I know that the biggest enemy in the eyes of Georgia fans right now is Mike Bobo, and I understand your gripes with him, but there's only so much criticism that you can give a guy when the wide receivers just can't make plays. They can't separate. Georgia's receivers, simply, to be honest with you and to be nice about it, to keep it PG-13, they weren't good. Zachariah Branch, not only can he do a lot after the catch, but he can just take the top off of defense. Georgia did not need this because they already won the SEC beating Texas with the offense that was nowhere as good in terms of star power than what Texas was. Texas had 2 NFL caliber receivers, the best offensive line in college football, and a lot of good running backs, and yet Georgia was still able to beat them despite their offense not being as stacked as what the Longhorns offense was. So now you give a Georgia team coming off a down season a weapon like Zachariah Branch. this is going to be one of the moves that helps Georgia continue their dominance over the SEC. I keep hearing talk about what's the possibility of Georgia finishing 9-3? I doubt that happens. Last season was the worst that we will ever see Georgia be under Kirby Smart. And yet, even when they were in wounded animal mode, they were still able to fight with their backs against the wall, and they were able to punch themselves out of a corner that a lot of us kind of doubted they would be able to get out of because of how great of a coach Kirby Smart is. So getting Zachariah Branch fixes Georgia's biggest problem on offense last year. Well, two of their biggest problems. I didn't really see him have too much of an issue with drops at USC. And now he adds dynamicism and explosiveness to a Georgia offense that was in desperate need of it last season. Now with Zachariah Branch, Georgia's offense is going to look entirely different this year because this is just instant offense. You just get Zachariah Branch the ball in his hands, rather if it's on special teams or you just find creative ways to get him involved on offense. He's one of these kinds of cats that has Tavon Austin, DeAnthony Thomas-like ability. His speed is something that you can't really prepare for until you see it in person. And he is one of those guys that once he gets going, he can completely break a game open for you. Georgia fans know what it's like to get dominated by just one receiver when you went up against Alabama last year and Ryan Williams was just pulling off all kinds of these miraculous plays. You lost that game because of how good Ryan Williams was. Zachariah Branch, he's not Ryan Williams per se in terms of skill set, but he has that kind of ability to impact the game in that kind of way for you. So when I saw that Zachariah Branch transferred to Georgia, I was like, man, them doggone dogs, man, they just keep on finding ways to do it. They just keep on finding ways to continue to dominate the SEC. Look, I think Texas might get it done this year, but I'm not counting out those dogs, and Zachariah Branch is a huge reason why. And with the questions that people have about Gunnar Stockton, one thing that helps him is that he doesn't need to be the most talented if you give him a great supporting cast. That's what made Sir Stetson Bennett, the mailman, so effective, because he just had a bunch of weapons to throw the football to. And when you got a guy like Zachariah Branch, it's not too hard to get him the ball. Just find a way to throw it to him and let that brother work in the open field. I can't wait to see what Zachariah Branch does at Georgia this year. This was one of the biggest pickups in the transfer portal by any team this year, and I believe he's going to have one of the biggest impact out of the transfer portal that we see this season. If you're a Colorado fan, you need to be rooting for Florida State to rebound this season under Mike Norvell, because if they don't, he will get fired and Deion Sanders will be hired as his replacement as FSU's new head coach, because Florida State can give Deion Sanders everything that he needs to win a national championship that he doesn't have access to at Colorado. Look, we all want Deion Sanders to bring a national championship to Colorado, but that is incredibly unlikely when you think of the hurdles that Deion Sanders has to overcome to be able to do that. Even though he is a really good coach, winning a national championship in college football is not about the X's and O's. It's about the Jimmies and Joes. And when you have schools like Oregon, Ohio State, and Texas paying $25 million to $30 million per season on their squads, it makes it a huge roadblock that Deion Sanders has to overcome, because he has to be able to win despite being at a talent discrepancy when Colorado ends up making it to the playoffs and they have to go up against some of these juggernaut teams to win a national title. Colorado gave Deion Sanders a fresh new contract extension a few months ago, and his buyout is only $12 million, which is incredibly cheap for a program like Florida State that has an influx of cash flow and a really passionate alumni. Deion Sanders is immortalized in the history of Florida State football. When you think of the Florida State Seminoles football program, Deion Sanders is one of the first names that you put to that Seminoles logo, to that Seminoles brand. And Florida State views themselves as a blue blood in this sport, and there wouldn't be no better way to get more momentum back into that program than hiring Deion Sanders. He'll have more NIL money to put together a good team. He'll have an easier time being able to recruit, being in Tallahassee, having access to all that in-state talent, which wouldn't be too far away. It's harder to lure guys from the state of Florida, at least some of the best players in the Sunshine State, to Boulder, due to Boulder not really being the most attractive destination for guys to want to play college football at, and also Deion Sanders not having the amount of money necessary in NIL to be able to land some of these blue chip 5 and 4 star guys. Yeah, he got Jordan Seaton and Travis Hunter, but the majority of these players are not Jordan Seaton and Travis Hunter. Those guys played for Colorado and got a lot less than what they could have gotten if they went to bigger programs because they wanted to play for Deion Sanders. And although Deion Sanders' face card makes some guys willing to hear him out and consider playing for him, most of the occasions when Colorado misses out on some of these elite recruits out of high school is because they can't win the building war for them. That's why Deion Sanders has been very vocal about having a salary cap in college football, because it makes it really hard to overcome some of these schools that can just throw millions of dollars at guys when Colorado only has access to so much cash, and they have to be able to spread it out among multiple players on multiple positions so they can have a competitive enough team to just have a good season. So if you already have all of these roadblocks that you have to deal with to build a championship squad at Colorado, it would make sense for Deion Sanders, if the FSU job comes available, to take it. And he's already done what was asked of him when he got to Colorado. He made them relevant, he put them back on the map, and he instilled a lot of buzz into the community and into that program that they haven't had in over 2 decades. And you gave them 2 of the best players ever in that program, and Travis Hunter and Shedeur Sanders. You have their jerseys retired, and Colorado has done everything they can to appease Deion Sanders, but I believe Colorado's AD and school president know that the Deion Sanders, the primetime train in Boulder, isn't going to last forever. They know that eventually a bigger program is going to come calling, and Deion Sanders eventually will end up coaching at a big-time school like a Florida State. And I'm not saying that Deion Sanders will leave Colorado for just anybody. It has to be a perfect situation for him, and FSU would be that situation. It would be incredibly hard for Deion Sanders to turn down the opportunity to coach the school that he ended up becoming a household name at. So if the FSU job comes available, that would be the worst nightmare for Colorado football, because essentially they make that one phone call to Deion Sanders and he's the first thing up on out of there. Well, JT, what about all the recruits? What about all the players that went to Colorado? These recruits, these guys that transfer to Colorado, are transferring to play for Deion Sanders. It is nothing for Deion Sanders to take the Florida State job and for all of those players that committed to play for him to follow him down to Tallahassee. When Marshall recently lost their head coach to Southern Miss, literally their entire team left in the transfer portal to follow him there. So if guys are committed to play for a coach, the transfer portal allows them to follow him anywhere he goes. It didn't matter if Deion Sanders went to the other part of the country. All of his players, Jordan Seaton, Juju Lewis, Amarion Miller, will all follow him wherever he goes, because those guys are at Colorado for Deion Sanders. And if Deion Sanders wants to win a national championship, he needs more resources that Colorado is going to be unable to give him. And I know that a good amount of people are going to disagree with this, and they're going to try to make all kinds of arguments why he won't leave, why he can win a national championship. You're being a little bit delusional. Deion Sanders has done a great job at winning with what he's been able to inherit. But for him to win a national championship, he needs a lot more that Colorado is incapable of being able to give him as compared to Florida State, which we've already seen in the past. Florida State put together a team that was good enough to contend for a national championship because they had way more NIL money, way more richer donors to donate to FSU, to get some of these big-time recruits out of high school, to get those good portal additions. That's what Colorado doesn't really have access to. Deion has been able to elevate a program doing more with less. So imagine what he can do at Florida State. And coaching in the ACC with the star power that Deion Sanders' name has will make it so much more easier for him to win a national championship, because then he can essentially dominate recruiting in the state of Florida because of his name. He also will have the NIL money to compete for some of the guys that he will lose out to at Colorado to schools like Texas and Ohio State and Oregon, because they just can't win a bidding war for certain players with those schools. While at FSU, Deion Sanders will be able to win those recruiting battles. He will be able to win those bidding wars. For all of you Colorado guys who are going to get upset and you're going to get your panties in a bunch over this because you believe that Deion Sanders can bring a national championship to Colorado, I'm going to remind you again, college football is not all about the X's and O's. It's about the Jimmies and the Joes. And the teams that are consistently competing for national championships, what do they all have in common? They have elite recruiting because they got a lot of money to pour into it. And they also are able to go out and get the best guys available in the portal when necessary. If that FSU job comes open, if Mike Norvell gets fired, I expect Deion Sanders to end up filling that vacancy, because I just can't see him passing up the opportunity to coach Florida State and to be a lot closer to home. Dan Lanning is entering his 4th season as the head coach of Oregon. He is 35-6 as the head coach of the Ducks. And the common question that gets asked about Dan Lanning every season is, when is he going to be able to deliver Oregon's first national championship? Because Oregon has pretty much unlimited NIL money thanks to Phil Knight. They have elite facilities, great resources. So Oregon has everything that's needed to win a national championship. So what's the holdup with them being unable to win one? And what gets kind of forgotten about is Dan Lanning is incredibly young. Did you know that Dan Lanning is only 39 years old? I thought that he was at least in his mid-40s. And when you look at the head coaches who have won national championships recently, like Ryan Day, Kirby Smart, it's happened around their 5th or 6th season. And this is Dan Lanning's first ever coaching job. And for him to be as dominant as what he has been so early into his tenure, not having any prior head coaching experience, is a sign that he eventually will get over the hump and he eventually will win a national championship at Oregon. But the question is when. And I think within the next 4 to 5 years, that's the window that we can expect for the Ducks to finally hoist a national championship trophy under Dan Lanning, because not only is he an incredible coach, he makes good in-game adjustments, but he normally assembles an elite staff. When he hired Kenny Dillingham, the guy got hired as a head coach after only calling plays for 1 season at Oregon. Then he ends up hiring Will Stein, who is one of the bright offensive minds in college football. He has one of the best offensive line coaches in America. There are some questions about his defensive coordinator, but for the most part, Oregon normally has a really good staff with Dan Lanning. He has an incredible eye for spotting good coaches, and he's a relentless recruiter. Oregon's recruiting was already really good under Mario Cristobal, but Dan Lanning took that recruiting and he multiplied it times 20, being a little bit more relentless and more aggressive in terms of how he goes after some of the best guys coming out of high school. Not only is he using money to sway these guys, but he's also stealing guys off of other teams. And this isn't anything that's alleged. This isn't he say. Like, Boise State's former offensive coordinator last year, Doug Carter, came out publicly and said openly that Oregon tried to poach some of their best players. So Oregon is out there doing whatever it takes to build a championship team. And why I feel so confidently that Oregon will win a national championship within the next 4 to 5 years under Dan Lanning is because when you watch Oregon play, they play like the West Coast version of Georgia. They're fast, violent, and the guys that they have on the offensive line and defensive line look exactly like the guys that you see playing on the line of scrimmage under Kirby Smart down there in Athens. They're just freakishly athletic. They're like 300-plus guys that can run 4.7, 4.8. The way that Georgia is built is the same way that Oregon is similarly built. You can tell that Oregon has identity a lot similar to what Georgia has with the kinds of guys that they choose to go after in recruiting. They're looking for athletic freaks. They're looking for monsters. And that's what Oregon has. I remember last year when I was watching Oregon pulverize Illinois, I was telling myself, this isn't a college football team. Essentially, what I was looking at was an NFL team just disguised as a college football team. That's what Oregon has become under Dan Lanning. When they were coached by Mario Cristobal, they were really good. But watching Oregon under Dan Lanning, I've never seen a team look so unfair than what Oregon does under Dan Lanning, because they just have guys that are just different than anybody else. That's the best way I can put it. So with the identity that Oregon has, essentially being the West Coast version of Georgia, it's not a matter of if Dan Lanning can win a national championship there. It's just a matter of when it'll happen. And with him only being 39 years old, he has plenty of years to get one. I feel like he will, because if he's having this amount of success getting this job when he was only, 34, 35 years old, incredibly young, think about how much growing he still has to do. He hasn't even reached the tip of the iceberg in terms of how good he's going to be as a head coach, because just like players, head coaches develop too. And Dan Lanning, for this to be his first ever job and to only have 6 losses, never having more than 3 losses in the season, shows you how good this guy already is, despite being so young. He already is arguably a top 5, top 7 head coach in the sport right now, depending on who you ask. But most people, I think, probably view him as a top 5 head coach. Everything that Oregon has been built on prior to Dan Lanning arriving there, he's taken and he's maximized it to its fullest abilities. So the only thing that Dan Lanning gets clowned on is that Oregon hasn't been able to reach and win a national championship yet under him. But that's going to have to happen sooner rather than later, with just how much they can put in the NIL to buy a good team every year, how relentless he is in the transfer portal and the recruiting. He does whatever it takes to win. And I became a huge fan of Dan Lanning for the pregame speech that he delivered to Colorado when I idiotically said that Colorado was going to upset Oregon and win that game. And as soon as I heard that speech, this game isn't being played in Hollywood. You play with your pads, you talk with your helmet. I said, okay, yeah, Colorado is about to get stomped out by Oregon. And that's exactly what happened. And Oregon just plays with a high level of violence and intensity that just has so many reminiscent shades of how Georgia plays under Kirby Smart. He also was an assistant for Nick Saban before he left to take that DC job at Georgia as well. And if you're a Nick Saban assistant, 9 times out of 10, you end up being an incredibly good coach. And for Dan Lanning to have learned under 2 of the best coaches in college football over the last 5 years or the last decade, I think that also has helped them. And that's why Oregon is the well-ran machine that they are right now under him. I don't think that we're going to be clowning Oregon for too much longer, being considered a blue blood without a national title, because eventually it's going to have to happen. Dan Lanning is just too elite of a coach and has just too much access to all of the money that he needs to dominate and the resources as well. So I expect for Oregon to win a national championship within the next 4 or 5 years. I'll be really shocked if they don't win one by that time frame being over. LSU's offense is going to deep fry everybody that they play this season. With the amount of firepower that they have on offense entering this season, they can cook you anytime from anywhere on the field, anytime they get possession of the football. You got Garrett Nussmeier, who is one of the best returning quarterbacks in college football entering this season. He was 10th in the nation in QBR in his first season as the full-time starter for LSU, and he has the potential to win the Heisman Trophy this year, because when Jayden Daniels and Joe Burrow won the Heisman Trophy at LSU, they did it in their second seasons, and what helped them is that they had a bunch of great receivers that were explosive to throw the football to. Garrett Nussmeier has the ability to follow down that same path that Joe Burrow and Jayden Daniels did in their second seasons with the firepower that LSU is giving him to throw the football to this year. This is the fastest receiving core in college football. You got Aaron Anderson, who runs 4.39. You got Nick Anderson out of the transfer portal, who 2 years ago at Oklahoma had 10 touchdowns, and he was averaging 21 yards per reception. Then you got Barian Brown out of the transfer portal to go along with Nick Anderson. Barian Brown, for the last 2 seasons, has been one of the most underrated receivers in America because he's been criminally underutilized by a Kentucky program that's been unable to get consistent and stable quarterback play along with great play calling. Then let's not forget about tight end Trudez Green, who is a 6'7" monster. He was the second best tight end coming out of high school in 2024. And Trudez Green is like Kyle Pitts on crack, because I don't know who the hell is going to stop this dude. When you're 6'7" and you're moving like him, and you can not just play tight end but receiver as well, it's hard to stop a monster like this. If you saw that bowl game that LSU had last year against Baylor, you'll understand how much of a problem Trudez Green is going to be this year. So not only do you have this 6'7" freak at tight end, receiver, wherever they choose to put him at, but you have the fastest and most explosive receiving core in college football. So Garrett Nussmeier, I think that the path is pretty clear for him to be a finalist in New York for the Heisman on Broadway this year. And then the running game should be improved this year. The ground game has been the biggest Achilles heel for LSU since Brian Kelly first took this job. He's really struggled to get the ground game going, but I think this year the ground game should actually be pretty good for LSU. You got Caleb Durham, who is going into his sophomore season after a phenomenal true freshman campaign where he was a SEC all-freshman selection. He had over 1,000 total yards in his first season in college football. He was averaging over 5 yards per attempt behind an offensive line that wasn't really that great at opening up running lanes. And he also is a really good threat coming out of the backfield with how good his hands are. So you essentially have a guy that can just do a bunch of different things. He's a mismatch for any defense because most linebackers aren't good enough to keep up with him in coverage. And he also is a really shifty and explosive runner as well. So everything that LSU has on offense this year, they're going to be able to just cook a lot of defenses that they go up against this year. At times, LSU's offense kind of got stuck in the mud, but it more so was because they tend to beat themselves. And the biggest issue with Garrett Nussmeier last season was that at times in the second half, he would just completely implode because he was too reckless with the football. Prime example was that Texas A&M game, when that game at one point they were in firm control of until midway through the third quarter. Garrett Nussmeier just felt like it was Christmas time, and he was handing away turnovers like they were Christmas gifts, like he was one of Santa's helpers. That's what you can expect out of a first-time starter. I believe in year 2, we'll see a more efficient Garrett Nussmeier who will be way better at taking care of the football. And when you're throwing the ball 40, nearly 50 times a game, you're going to have a few turnovers here or there, because the more you throw the football, the more you increase the chances of your quarterback turning it over. So if LSU being able to play a more complementary style of offense this year, you should see Garrett Nussmeier's turnovers decrease this season. The offensive line, yeah, they do lose a lot of production from last year, but at times the offensive line tend to be a little bit up and down despite the amount of talent they had at that unit. I think this year the offensive line play should still be as good because LSU has recruited the offensive line at a really high level, and they do have a good amount of guys that have had significant snaps. So I don't think that's really going to be a weakness of this offense. I don't really think this LSU offense has a weakness at all. I mean, anytime they get possession of the football with just the snap of a finger, they can put 7 points up on the board on you with the amount of speed and how much explosiveness that they have on this side of the ball this year. It's going to be incredibly tough for any defense to slow down this offense. That's why this LSU unit is going to be able to just deep fry everybody, because if you want to play the run, they're going to be able to kill you over the top with play action. And if you want to try to slow down the play action pass game, they can just run the football at will against you. It's just really hard to find a way to stop an offense that has this amount of explosiveness and this kind of speed at receiver and at running back. And when you got a gunslinger like Garrett Nussmeier slinging that rock, this is an offense that's going to be really potent this upcoming season.